Hey everybody, this is Patrick in Columbia. I'm focusing on the rain recovery and rebuilding from the impact of the 1,000-year flood in Columbia from October of 2015. During those dates, October 1st through 4th, South Carolina experienced 11 trillion gallons of water falling across the state. Map there showing where the intensity level was there across the state. So there was water everywhere. The upper left picture is a photo from my neighborhood. Upper right is from the Garners Ferry Gills Creek area that actually flooded from the Gills Creek watershed. And then the bottom picture is the overhead picture of the Congaree River. And you can notice how high the water comes up on the bridge into the downtown area from the west side of town. The Columbia Canal, which was breached, is in the upper left portion of that photo. Just kind of shows you some water and the amounts of water we had. This is actually my neighborhood coming out of my neighborhood. We made the NBC National News there. We see the ditch that was created, but that's just pictures of the water and just the intensity of the rushing water that we had over the 3-day period. So as part of this project, I looked at the United Way of the Midlands and how they stepped up their game to become part of the flood recovery and rebuild effort in Columbia. United Way was founded in 1955 as the community chest and now has 6 services, 6 counties in the Midlands areas, United Way of the Midlands. About 3 or 4 years ago, they revamped their mission statement and business plan to address impact areas, and the impact areas that they focus on are education, children's education, homelessness, and vulnerable populations. So they're my agency. So a little bit of baseline data and understanding from FEMA and through this process was if the storm or flood damage was related to poor prior maintenance, FEMA would not pay for repairs. If a roof needed replacement before the storm, the damage from leaks is not considered storm related. And in South Carolina, there were 24 counties that were declared disaster areas by FEMA. We only have 46 in the state, so a little over half the counties in the state were considered disaster areas. So in Richland County alone, which is Columbia, there were 8,700 FEMA applications, which accounted for 20% of all applications statewide. And 69% of those applications, folks were without means, which means they had not the resources and they lacked the resources to repair their homes. 54% were low income, and of this number, a third were 65 plus. So United Way of the Midlands looked at a sample of 20 homes that fell into this description, and what they found was the difference between the FEMA verified loss and the contractor's repair estimate was a ratio of 16-1. Huge margins. The average FEMA payment was $2,400, and the average contractor's estimate was $39,999, right at $40,000. So you see where we're getting to. So, in order for something to happen, the United Way of the Midlands would have to be the change agent to develop a recovery plan that would advocate for homeowners who were uninsured, the vulnerable, and the elderly. And the picture is Mrs. Anderson, who climbed out of her home, was rescued out of the attic of her home the night of the flood. Sweet little lady. So, a couple of quotes here. Mac Bennett, who is a very good friend of mine, former CEO of the United Way, just retired, talking about the floods bringing the heroic efforts by people across our community. He was inspired by the things they did, as opposed to what Mayor Benjamin says on the Weather Channel. I believe that things will get worse before they get better. And as we all remember, the first thing we want to do is care about our people. And you see how you've got a nonprofit leader who's looking at the characteristics of leadership as opposed to a city manager who's creating more hysteria than we really needed to have. So there was a Sunday phone call that the city manager made to Mac Bennett, wanting him to open the winter shelter, which was basically the homeless shelter for folks who were evacuating. She had heard that there was a little bit of rain and people were evacuating. And so what happens if he had not answered that Sunday phone call, that early morning call? There was no other organization with the resources and the capacity that could have led such a massive recovery. And the city was hugely overwhelmed with infrastructure issues, failing dams, 20 dams breached, plus the main water canal was breached. And not only that, frustrated citizens for lack of reply. So this is my road access into my neighborhood that took the city 9 months to repair a less than a tenth of a lane road asphalt project. They had to dig it out, they replaced the culverts, and hopefully it will last more than 1,000 years now, but it just shows the monstrosity of the projects they were dealing with. My neighborhood has about 750 homes. This was one of our only ways in and out of our neighborhood. We had to go on a detour route for 9 months, which it also not only messed up traffic during commute times, that kind of stuff, but also school bus routes and emergency vehicles had to be rerouted as well too for 9 months. So in the recovery process, what didn't work, according to United Way, is that the state did a terrible job of hiring and managing the case management contract, and all communities paid the price in poor quality service. It was evident in some of the repair work that went on. The United Way did everything possible to access the state housing authority's flood funds, but the state housing authority's poor understanding of disaster floods and prevention prevented United Way from really getting the resource. It shows that the state housing folks were not prepared for a flood of this nature. So Richland and Lexington counties were excluded, and Columbia excluded from the state recovery plan because United Way pursued federal relief. And the United Way of the Midlands has worked for 2 years restoring homes before the federal funding from HUD or FEMA actually was deployed in the community. So it just shows how slow the process of the federal government and state government really was with flood recovery. So poor people, especially the elderly and the disabled with substandard homes, receive very little assistance from FEMA because the damage to a home, as I mentioned, that is not kept up is not funded. And you can see the example of the home, the kitchen there, that's basically just a disaster area, contaminated with mold, mildew, and just poor construction. So what worked in this process was United Way of the Midlands created a website that raised $1.1 million in the first month, and half of those contributions coming out of state. These funds were used for repair and rebuild work we'll talk about a little bit later. They've since then raised another $1.2 billion with grants and other donations, including a telethon on the first anniversary of the flood. We like to commemorate anniversaries in South Carolina, and they did a great job with that. They also incorporated voluntary agencies, local and national organizations, Homeworks of America, South Carolina, the St. Bernard Project out of New Orleans. They know disaster relief and recovery. They know rebuilding homes. They're organized to provide volunteers. And the big thing about this in their repair was that they were able to reduce some of the repair costs by 20%. So United Way has been able to deploy more than $400,000 to these groups, primarily for home repair and mold treatment, which is huge in flood recovery. So United Way, this is I think very interesting too, is how that they took FEMA's model for recovery with a grain of salt. Anita Floyd at the United Way, who was one of my subjects that I talked with in this project and know her, talked about how that FEMA got in their way, but they could get around FEMA with some of the work that they were doing. So it sped up the recovery and rebuild efforts that they had. So United Way developed a special program for mold remediation, including purchasing industrial drying equipment, supplies, and chemicals for the rebuild group, and distributed household humidifiers to families waiting help. So you can see that when you were rebuilding and cleaning out a house, mold and mildew can just get in your lungs. So you had to go with a special suit. You have to be masked. You have to have gloves. I mean, mold and mildew is just a gross thing to clean out. So they also conducted a blitz build in December 2015, the week between Christmas and New Year's. There were several organizations, Homework, St. Bernard, the Michael J. Mungo Foundation. The Mungos are a huge home builder in the South Carolina area, ARP and the home builders. We all got together and conducted the first blitz build across the Midlands. Super successful. So there were about 50 projects, construction sites that went on with about 1,500 volunteers. And what really is really cool, this is one of the homes that the Dutch Fork High School Beta Club worked on. And the little darling with the white t-shirt and blue shorts is my daughter, Allie, who is a senior at Dutch Fork this year and going to Clemson in the fall. But this is the home that the Beta Club worked on. And you'll notice that it's a moderately looking medium income home. The flood did not discriminate. It hit $1 million homes. It hit poor folks. It hit rich folks. It didn't discriminate. And I think that's what's so important about this effort, is how this community came together, neighbor helping neighbor, friend helping friend, stranger helping stranger, recover and rebuild that they could. So United Way's goal was to get individual families back in their homes sooner than the 3 to 7 years projected for the recovery. And this is actually a photo of the homeowner that the Beta Club and the St. Bernard Project worked on there. And what's really cool about what United Way has done through this project and how they've been so successful at it is they've completed home repairs and rebuilds to 231 homes. Their goal is 250 homes, and that 231 is as of Friday this past week. And they'll hit that 250 goal. And what's even more important is how United Way has developed a flood recovery plan, and they're in it for the long run. They've created a website. They've created how folks can help. They're in it as an impact area. And as they said, Columbia is our home, and we're going to make sure we rebuild it and people have an opportunity to live in their own homes. So it's the program is ingrained in the United Way's business plan it's invited into what we'll be doing is there. So this is one of the ladies. I thought she was really sweet when I was doing Blitzbill photos that afternoon, and she had found a 4-leaf clover. And we talk about what kind of recommendations this project could have, or the case could have, is how it's a best practice for other cities facing disasters and anything that can happen, and how you go around and get around the federal guidelines of FEMA, how a community comes together and helps people in need, and how when you look at it going back to the FEMA guidelines, that people just didn't have anything. They didn't have a savings account to rebuild their home. They didn't have a trust fund or just money laying in the backyard to rebuild their homes. These homes had to be cleaned out. They had to be demolded, demildewed, and basically just taken care of. So it was just a really interesting project. But this lady just really kind of sums up the hope that this community has when it comes to flood relief and flood recovery.